Tokyo was asleep under a cloudless sky when the first droning hum echoed across the Pacific horizon. At 12:08 a.m., the sound became a roar, a deep, rolling thunder of engines that shook the earth before the flames ever touched it. Below, millions of Japanese civilians stirred in confusion, unaware that the most destructive air raid in human history was seconds away from beginning. Over 270 B-29 superfortresses approached the capital from the Marianas, flying low, far lower than ever before, to unleash a weapon no one had ever seen used on such a scale: fire itself. General Curtis LeMay had changed everything. Gone were the high-altitude precision raids, the expensive armor plating, and the pretense of clean warfare. The B-29s carried no conventional bombs that night. Instead, they carried hundreds of thousands of M69 napalm bomblets, clusters of jellied gasoline designed to ignite on impact, splattering molten fire across wood, paper, and flesh alike. Tokyo, built from tinder and bamboo, was the perfect target. What LeMay planned was not an attack on factories or railways. It was a calculated annihilation of the urban heart of Japan, to burn its will to fight out of existence. At 12:15 a.m., the first wave of superfortresses opened their bomb bays. What fell looked like silver rain in the moonlight, thin metal casings tumbling silently before bursting open in midair. The fire spread instantly, sucking oxygen from the streets, creating tornadoes of flame that roared higher than the rooftops. The wind itself turned lethal, pulling entire families into the inferno. In the first 30 minutes, the oxygen content of Tokyo's eastern wards dropped so low that people suffocated before the flames reached them. Pilots flying above could smell the burning city even from 7,000 feet, a sickly, oily scent that clung to the air long after the smoke rose surpassed their altitude. One American gunner wrote later that the city looked like a living thing, writhing, glowing, moving. Japanese air defenses were paralyzed. The flak guns went silent. Fighter pilots who scrambled to intercept never even reached the B-29s before being blinded by the glare of the fires below. The sky over Tokyo was red, molten, and alive, and it marked the night when warfare itself changed forever. From the ground, the world had ended. Tokyo's eastern wards, Koto, Chuo, and Taito, became oceans of fire. The napalm bomblets burst into the walls of wooden homes, splattering flaming gel across tatami mats and paper screens. Within minutes, the narrow streets became traps. Families fled toward the Sumida River, carrying children, grandparents, and what little they could salvage. But the river offered no salvation. The firestorm fed on its own fury, drawing hurricane winds into its core, sweeping fire across the water like liquid sunlight. Witnesses later described the air itself catching fire. The flames moved faster than a man could run. The heat reached over 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit, melting metal, glass, and even the iron frames of bicycles abandoned in panic. People threw themselves into the canals, hoping the water would protect them, but the napalm floated, burning atop the surface and consuming the oxygen beneath. Survivors later wrote that they heard a steady crackling sound unlike anything they'd known before. Not the crack of gunfire, but the sound of human bodies igniting. By 2:00 a.m., the fires had merged into a single wall of flame, stretching across 16 square miles of Tokyo. Japanese civil defense crews tried to fight back. Men with bamboo buckets and hand pumps struggled to reach the burning zones, but the roads were gone, water pressure failed, telephone lines melted. The imperial palace itself was shrouded in smoke, and Emperor Hirohito, awake through the night, stood on the veranda watching his capital disappear beneath a sea of red. Even he could hear the screaming. The American pilots circling above could barely comprehend the devastation below. They flew without formation, guided only by the glow of Tokyo itself. LeMay had ordered them to drop markers over key districts, but they no longer needed coordinates. The entire city was visible from 150 miles away. Bombardier John D. Kuhn later wrote that Tokyo wasn't a city anymore, it was a furnace. Inside that furnace, an estimated 100,000 people would die before dawn. More than Hiroshima, more than Nagasaki, in a single night of man-made fire. And still, the bombers came, wave after wave, until nothing was left to burn. By dawn, Tokyo was a blackened wound stretching to the horizon. Smoke rose higher than the clouds, carrying ash, embers, and the smell of burnt humanity into the stratosphere. The B-29 crews flying back to Tinian could still see the glow of the fires 700 miles away, a city still burning after sunrise. When the first reconnaissance planes returned, their photographs stunned even the hardened men of the U.S. Army Air Forces. 16 square miles of the world's largest city had been erased. Over 1 million people were homeless. Streets had melted into tar. Canals had boiled. Entire neighborhoods had vanished. The U.S. intelligence analysts who reviewed the footage saw more than destruction. They saw confirmation that fire could cripple an empire. The Japanese government, though paralyzed, refused to acknowledge the magnitude of the disaster. The military censored news reports, ordered photographers not to document the worst zones, and forbade citizens from speaking openly about the dead. But diaries from survivors told what official reports never could. A young nurse, Tomiko Aizawa, wrote that she could not recognize the faces of the people she tried to save. Their skin had peeled away, revealing white bone beneath. Another survivor, a police officer named Kiyoshi Sato, described how he found hundreds of corpses stacked in alleyways, burned black and small as children. What shocked Japanese air defense commanders most was not the scale of the destruction, but how powerless they had been to stop it. The B-29s had flown low, below radar, stripping Tokyo's defenses of their advantage. Anti-aircraft guns couldn't track them. Fighters scrambled too late. Even the vaunted searchlight crews were blinded by the reflected inferno below. The empire's capital had been stripped bare, not by nuclear weapons, but by gasoline and wind. LeMay's headquarters analyzed the mission. Its results with cold precision, fuel consumption, altitude, weather patterns, all data to refine the next raid. There was no triumph, no celebration, just silence in the operations rooms as officers read the casualty estimates. The success of the firebombing meant only one thing. It would happen again. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, each would follow in the coming weeks. The weapon was not a bomb. It was fire itself, and it had no mercy. In the following nights, Japan became a country of flames. The skies over Osaka, Nagoya, and Kobe turned crimson as the same low-flying B-29 formations returned, guided by LeMay's doctrine of total incendiary warfare. The raids no longer sought factories or shipyards. They targeted the human geography of Japan, the wooden homes, the narrow streets, the vital networks that sustained the nation's war machine. In less than 3 weeks, over 60 Japanese cities were attacked, each reduced to ash by incendiary clusters that rained like molten hail. The Japanese population lived in constant dread of the nocturnal hum that preceded the inferno. They built makeshift shelters, dug trenches, and filled bathtubs in desperate attempts to survive. But napalm made every precaution futile. Survivors described the way fire ran across the ground like water, flowing down alleys and through open doorways. The wind that followed a bombing run was so violent that it lifted people off their feet and hurled them back into the blaze. Mothers were found clutching blackened infants, fathers buried in the ruins of their homes, still holding empty buckets. Among American crews, the horror began to erode the initial sense of duty. Some pilots vomited upon returning to base after witnessing what they called cities of ghosts. Others shut down emotionally, counting sorties and fuel logs to avoid confronting the human toll. In one of the mission debriefs, a gunner quietly asked his superior, "Are we still soldiers or something else now?" No answer was recorded. LeMay himself was unapologetic. He believed Japan would never surrender unless its cities were broken from within. "If we lose," he said coldly, "we'll be tried as war criminals, so we'd better make sure we don't lose." The Japanese military could not counter the fire. Their radar network was fragmented, their night fighters outdated. Even the famed Zero was useless in the darkness against bombers that struck from multiple altitudes. By June 1945, more than half of Japan's urban area had been burned out. Millions fled to the countryside, carrying the smell of smoke in their hair and clothes. The empire that once dreamed of conquest now existed in a landscape of ashes. And above it all, the B-29s continued to come, night after night, silent until the moment they turned the sky into a burning ocean. Amid the ruins, Tokyo's survivors moved like shadows through a wasteland of twisted metal and scorched earth. The air remained heavy with the scent of burnt rubber and flesh. Entire districts had disappeared. Maps were useless, street names meaningless. Where there had been markets, schools, and shrines, there was now only charred emptiness. The Japanese government attempted to maintain order, distributing masks to hide the stench and assigning students to collect bones from the rubble. Trains carried the wounded out of the city, their carriages filled with the silent, bandaged remnants of a population that had seen the apocalypse. Doctors worked without morphine. Hospitals overflowed with victims whose burns covered every inch of their bodies. The napalm clung to skin, resistant to water, reigniting even after being doused. Surgeons resorted to cutting it away with blades heated over open flames. Nurses fainted from exhaustion and smoke inhalation. Those who survived often wished they hadn't. Diaries recovered later from the ruins describe people wandering aimlessly through the destruction, calling names that no one answered. One entry read simply, "I saw my mother on the street. She was sitting, but she was no longer alive." The imperial military's psychological grip began to fracture. Civilians whispered about the government's inability to protect them. Many began to question the emperor's divinity, an unthinkable act months earlier. Yet censorship remained absolute. The press could not mention casualty figures, nor could they describe the nature of the new American weapon. Only vague words like raids and losses appeared in print, concealing the enormity of the event from those outside the burned zones. Foreign correspondents were barred from entering Tokyo entirely. The truth of what had happened on March 9th remained buried in silence. American intelligence, meanwhile, monitored intercepted Japanese communications with clinical detachment. Reports indicated widespread panic, collapse of industrial output, and mass displacement. For Washington, it was proof that LeMay's strategy was working. Plans were already underway to extend the campaign to every major population center: Fukuoka, Shizuoka, Kagoshima. But among some officers, a quiet unease began to spread. They understood what these raids had become. Not battles, but systematic erasure. And somewhere deep within the fire-blackened ruins of Tokyo, a new thought began to take hold. If this was what conventional bombing could do, what would happen when America unveiled the weapon it had not yet used? In the months that followed, Japan's nights became synonymous with terror. The moment the air raid sirens began, whole neighborhoods descended into chaos. Families clutching bundles of belongings, running barefoot over splintered debris, searching for any shelter that might resist the heat. Yet most knew it was futile. The B-29s had learned to come in waves, alternating altitudes, igniting the cities in layers so no refuge could survive. Over 67 Japanese cities were burned between March and August 1945, their populations erased not by precision strikes, but by storms of flame. The destruction of Tokyo remained the centerpiece of that campaign. Intelligence officers studying the aftermath uncovered data so disturbing it was kept classified for decades. The heat generated by the firestorm had reached over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, enough to melt copper and fuse clay roof tiles into glass. Winds over 100 miles per hour fed the inferno, turning the city into a vortex of burning oxygen. Corpses were found stacked along riverbanks where people had tried to escape, their bodies boiled in the rising water. The death toll was officially listed at 83,000. But internal U.S. estimates, drawn from aerial photography and survivor counts, placed it closer to 120,000. Yet despite the horror, Japan's military leadership refused to surrender. The Imperial General Staff interpreted the firebombings as an attempt to break morale, not an existential threat. They promised retribution through suicide missions, kamikaze attacks, balloon bombs, and secret weapons that never came to fruition. Among the Japanese people, despair coexisted with defiance. The will to survive hardened into silence. Families buried their dead without ceremony, believing that grief itself had become a luxury they could no longer afford. Inside American bases on Tinian and Saipan, the men of the 313th B Bombardment Wing prepared for what they called Operation Meetinghouse 2, a repeat of Tokyo, refined to mathematical precision. The crews were efficient now, their routines mechanical. They no longer flinched at the sight of burned cities from the air. War had become arithmetic. Curtis LeMay, reviewing reconnaissance photos, knew that Japan could not endure much longer. Yet what haunted some of his officers was not whether the strategy worked, but whether the line between necessity and atrocity had already been crossed. In the blackened ruins of Tokyo, that line had long since turned to ash. By July 1945, Japan's cities were nothing but outlines, ghost grids of what had once been life. From the air, reconnaissance pilots could trace entire neighborhoods only by the shadows of foundations. Tokyo, Nagoya, and Yokohama had been reduced to patterns of destruction visible from 20,000 feet, black scars etched into the earth. The air raids had taken everything: infrastructure, housing, food, and spirit. Millions of civilians slept under makeshift tarps, while farmers in the countryside dug mass graves for the displaced. The empire had been hollowed out, yet the war dragged on. At Imperial General Headquarters, desperation turned inward. Reports of mass civilian deaths were quietly locked away. Even the emperor received filtered updates, stripped of casualty numbers. Ministers spoke of victory through endurance, while the city burned around them. But among the lower ranks, the illusion was gone. Military policemen wrote in secret journals that morale had collapsed and that people no longer looked to the sky in fear. They looked with resignation. They had seen the worst that man could create, and they had no illusions left. In American command posts, a different kind of secrecy grew. While LeMay continued the incendiary campaign, a parallel project was approaching completion in the deserts of New Mexico, a weapon unlike any other, one that made even the architects of the firebombing uneasy. Documents later revealed that the testing of this special bomb was accelerated partly because of what the fire raids had proven, that Japan's cities, built of wood and faith, could be obliterated by heat and pressure alone. If fire could consume a nation, then what could light itself do? Among the American airmen, a grim mythology took shape. They spoke of Tokyo as if it were cursed ground, a place where the earth had screamed. Pilots who flew that night described, "I bet seeing entire districts lift into the air, torn apart by the suction of the firestorm." Some swore they saw figures running in the flames long after the city should have been dead. Even decades later, they remembered the color of the sky, not red, but white, blinding, endless. For many, that memory became their own kind of punishment. The fire had done its work, but it had also branded the men who delivered it. And in a few short weeks, the world would see something even darker descend from the sky. August arrived like the final chapter of a nightmare that had already gone too far. By then, Japan's air defenses were shattered, its factories silent, its people half-starved. The firebombings had erased 40% of the nation's cities, yet the Imperial Command still refused surrender. Underground bunkers beneath Tokyo buzzed with delusion. Talk of decisive battles, of repelling an invasion that could never be stopped. They did not yet understand that the firestorms had been only a prelude. On August 6, 1945, at 8:15 a.m., a lone B-29, the Enola Gay, released a single weapon over Hiroshima. It did not scatter napalm or incendiary gel. It released the sun. Within seconds, a city of 350,000 ceased to exist. The bomb's flash reached temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun, vaporizing everything at ground zero. Where Tokyo had burned slowly, Hiroshima simply vanished. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. For those who survived the fire raids, this new weapon was beyond comprehension. They had already lived through hell. Now they saw the sky itself ignite. The contrast was chilling. The firebombing of Tokyo had been a human act, deliberate, methodical, almost industrial. It required planning, fuel, and willpower. But Hiroshima was impersonal. The bomb fell, the world ended, and the silence afterward was absolute. Yet in a strange way, the firebombings had prepared the world to accept it. The moral threshold had already been crossed in Tokyo's ashes. The idea that civilians could be targeted as instruments of war had become normalized. By the time the atomic bomb fell, humanity was already numb. In the weeks that followed, American teams entered Tokyo again, not as bombers, but as surveyors. They documented the damage, collected data, photographed ruins that no longer smelled of smoke but of something far older, decay. Engineers noted how wooden houses had burned faster than expected, how fire breaks had failed, how napalm had clung to concrete. It was clinical, detached, as if the destruction itself had become a laboratory. Few spoke of the people who once lived there. To history, Tokyo was a data point, a precursor to the atomic age. The fire had been a teacher, and its lesson was simple. Once humanity learned to burn cities, it would never forget how. When Japan finally surrendered on August 15, 1945, the radio broadcast reached a nation too broken to react. In Tokyo, survivors of the March firebombing gathered in what was left of Ueno Park, standing silently as the emperor's voice, distant and trembling, echoed through the ruins. For the first time in history, they heard him speak. His words were vague, ceremonial, but one phrase pierced through the static. We must endure the unendurable. For millions who had endured the firestorms, there was nothing left to endure. The war had taken everything. The Allied occupation that followed unearthed the full extent of the devastation. American survey teams documented over 330,000 civilians killed by firebombing across Japan, though unofficial estimates were far higher. In Tokyo alone, 267,000 buildings had been erased, leaving behind a landscape so barren that U.S. officers described it as a city flattened by the hand of God. Yet within this desolation, life began to stir again. Children scavenged bricks from collapsed homes. Women planted vegetables in the ashes. The same streets that had once glowed red with flame now shimmered with puddles after rain. For many Americans, the fire raids quickly faded from memory. They were overshadowed by the atomic bombings, which monopolized the moral and historical debate. But for Japan, the night of March 9-10 became an unspoken wound, too immense, too personal to discuss. Survivors rarely spoke of it, even within families. Diaries were hidden away, photographs destroyed, memories locked behind silence. Historians would later call it the Forgotten Massacre, not because it lacked records, but because those who lived through it could not bear to remember. Among the few American officers who returned to Japan after the war, some were haunted by what they saw. General Curtis LeMay, awarded for his effectiveness, later admitted privately that if the U.S. had lost, he would have been tried as a war criminal. Yet he never expressed regret, only certainty that it had been necessary. His doctrine of total war became a blueprint for future conflicts, where civilian and military targets blurred beyond distinction. In Tokyo's ruins, the age of modern warfare had been born, not in the blinding flash of an atomic bomb, but in the slow, relentless burning of an ordinary night. In the years that followed, Tokyo rebuilt itself from soot and silence. The streets that once ran with molten fire became avenues of glass and steel. Children played where corpses had once lain, factories rose where neighborhoods had been erased. The city's rebirth was swift, almost defiant, yet beneath its modern skyline, the ghosts remained. Archaeologists digging foundations in post-war decades uncovered layers of fused soil, bones intermingled with melted tiles, fragments of pottery glazed by fire. They called it the ash stratum, a geological scar marking the night when humanity reached its own threshold. For survivors, memory lived not in monuments, but in silence. Each March, as the winds shifted over the Sumida River, the smell of smoke returned faintly to the air. The elderly spoke of it as if it were a season, the season of fire. Many never received recognition, their suffering eclipsed by Hiroshima and Nagasaki's shadow. The U.S. archives held thousands of photographs, aerial maps, and pilot testimonies sealed for decades, deemed too disturbing for public release. When some were finally declassified, the images showed not battlefields, but cities reduced to black dust. No enemy soldiers, no weapons, only civilians, frozen in the moment the air itself turned against them. Among historians, the Tokyo firebombing became a moral abyss, a place where logic dissolved into terror. It was the night when war abandoned all restraint, when victory and vengeance became indistinguishable. The technology that made it possible would shape every conflict that followed. Napalm would be refined, perfected, and used again. In Korea, in Vietnam, in places far removed from the ashes of Tokyo, yet born from the same doctrine. What began as a mission of war became a method of control, the power to erase entire populations through fire. Today, the scars of that night are visible to the eye, but not to the earth. Beneath Tokyo's endless towers and neon lights lies the memory of March 9, 1945, a night when the sky became a weapon, and humanity discovered that destruction could be more efficient than hate. The flames that consumed the city did not just burn wood and flesh. They burned away the illusion that war could ever again be contained. From that night forward, mankind understood the truth. Once a city burns, the world is never the same again.